So, next up is Josh Lehner, who is the senior economist with the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. How do you introduce yourself, Josh, when you're at a party or something? Hey, what do you do, man? Forecast for the economy. Is that easier than forecasting the weather? I'm going to get a resolution to this one before we are done with this event. All right, we'll have that discussion maybe a little bit later. Josh works as the senior economist with the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis, located in the Oregon Department of Administrative Services. He develops the quarterly Oregon Economic Forecast, which is available via email, and I read it. I don't know if that makes me a geek also. Thank you for not making any comments there. Projections for employment, personal income, wages, additional responsibilities include the Oregon Index of Leading Indicators, tracking international developments in Oregon's export markets, and forecasting revenues for the Oregon Lottery, the Oregon Judicial Department, and state tobacco taxes. And that is just, that's interesting to me. Mr. Lehner's economic research, published primarily on the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis blog, has been cited by Calculated Risk, The Economist, Economist's View, Financial Times, National Public Radio, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other local media. Prior to joining the state, Mr. Lehner worked as a research analyst for a local economic development organization and published a paper on the border tax effect between neighboring jurisdictions, I would presume like Oregon and Washington, for example. He earned a BA in economics from the University of Colorado and an MS in economics from Portland State University. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Scott. Like you said, yeah, I generally just introduce myself at parties with people that I do the economic forecast for the state of Oregon, and then the conversation kind of dies down, and people are like, oh, that's interesting. Because a lot of times, I live more up in the Portland metropolitan area, so, I got friends and colleagues that work at Intel and Nike, and they do all this really exciting international stuff and development of new computer chips and new technologies and the like, and I find it fascinating to talk with them about their day-to-day jobs. And then as Lawrence and David know, we kind of sit in our offices or our cubicles and we stare at a computer screen most of the day, just going over data and data and data, and we put up graphs. So sometimes people don't find that as interesting. But I'm here today to share with you some of those graphs, and so lucky for you. Just last week, we put out our major economic and revenue forecast for the state. In the odd number years, in the May month, we put out the revenue forecast that basically sets the spending limitation for the 2-year budget for the state of Oregon. So we just did that last week, so a lot of the outlook and information I have for you is pretty fresh. I'm not going to talk a lot about the revenue perspective, but if some of the local government individuals want to talk about that later on, I'll be more than happy to do that. First off, the state of Oregon is in expansion. We're continuing to forecast for an expansion, just as David and Lawrence said. The outlook is starting to improve. There's been 2 major weights on the economy, both at the national level here in Oregon, and in more particular in the more rural areas in the state of Oregon, housing and government. The housing sector has been in the doldrums, continuously for the last few years, but in the last year and a half, it's really picked back up, and so that's really supporting growth across the state. And state and local governments have been in a long period of cutbacks, both from a budgetary point of view and from an employment point of view. Those are now starting to stabilize across the state. The K-12 education system appears to be more or less finished across the state with laying off teachers, although maybe this next school year we'll see a few more rounds of layoffs in different pockets of the state. So right there, that's where we're going to get some pickup in employment. Housing's coming back. We're starting to get some construction jobs, some mortgage originators jobs, some realtor jobs and the like moving forward. And then state and local government are more or less stabilizing. So the 2 major weights on the economy are lifting. We're starting to get job growth spread across the state, predominantly had originally been in the Portland area. So all these combinations together, we're pretty optimistic about the outlook. With that being said, we're not going to get back to the rates of growth we saw during previous expansions. We still believe the long-run forecast for the state of Oregon, and for the nation for that matter, will be slower than what we've seen in recent decades. Typically, we'd get 3.5% private sector employment growth in the state of Oregon. So far in recovery, we've seen 2% here in the state, and moving forward, we expect that to improve to about 2.6% moving forward. So it's a big improvement from what we've seen. This lackluster sort of doesn't feel very good recovery we've seen in the last couple of years. We expect that to pick up, but not get back to some of the rates we've seen before. So here's what I'm going to talk about, a little bit about the state of Oregon overall, some of the recent trends we're seeing, outlook for the state, and then dive into some of the southern Oregon data in particular. The Medford region, I'll kind of interchange between Jackson, Josephine, even Douglas County a little bit to talk about some of the employment trends, some of the migration trends, some of the things that are driving the local economy. Recent performance in Oregon, these are coincident indicators. These are basically how are things going on in the economy right now. They're not leading indicators. Those continue to look pretty good for the state of Oregon. Both our office produces a set of leading indicators and the University of Oregon produces a set of leading indicators. They're both showing continued expansion right now. We're seeing good movements in all the different indicators, whether it's unemployment claims, hours worked for manufacturing. You can see up here on this graph, the manufacturing sector continues to expand here, and that's really good news because we remain a state that produces items. We still manufacture all the computer chips up in the Willamette Valley in the Portland area. The mills are humming a little bit down here in southern Oregon, so we are still producing, even though the level of production might be a little bit lower than we're used to prior to the recession, or we're continuing to expand. You can see these different indicators, whether it's employment or the unemployment rate, they're continuous to slowly move in the proper direction or the direction you'd like to see, and that's part of just the slow, steady, lackluster growth we've seen overall in the state of Oregon. We're expecting that to pick up a little bit moving forward, but you can just see across the board the state's in continued expansion. One of the reasons for that is we're starting to see household balance sheets become more in line with sort of the level of income versus their level of debt. This shows the state of Oregon's debt-to-income ratio for credit cards, automobile loans, and mortgages. That's the graph on the left. And you can see it started to decline 2010, 2011. People started paying off their debts. Unfortunately, a lot of the decline in the mortgage debt has to do with foreclosures, right? So the people were getting foreclosed on, and so the silver lining of losing your house during the foreclosure process is you also lose the loan. You no longer have that debt hanging over your head, and so household balance sheets are starting to be repaired as income growth happens, but also as the foreclosure process works its way through the state. We're starting to see an increase in debt levels for good fundamental reasons, not necessarily for the bad reasons, if that makes sense. And then one thing I wanted to highlight, this doesn't have a clicker on it. The county levels on the left-hand side is really, really important. You can see it's the 2007 level of debt-to-income ratio by county is the dark blue area, and then the light blue area is the 2011 data. The 2012 numbers should come out any month now. It's lagged quite a bit when you get down to some of the local, regional levels. And you can see there's been a big improvement in some of the regions of the state that have been hardest hit by the recession. Also some of the places that had the largest run-up in home prices, run-up in home buildings. You can see Deschutes County, Crook County, Central Oregon right there. And then a little bit further down, you see Jackson and Josephine counties. We're starting to see a lot of improvement in this debt-to-income ratio, these household balance sheets at the local level in the two regions of the state, the Central Oregon and down here in Southern Oregon, that had the largest, most pronounced housing bubble or housing cycle during this time period. And we find that very, very encouraging. Since 2011, it's gone down in 2012 based on a lot of the data we're seeing. It's continued to improve. So as households get their fundamental balance sheets back in order, or at least on better equal footing than what they were during the peak of the credit bubble we saw back in the mid-2000s, that should support consumer spending, right? You don't have to worry about paying off all your debts. You're paying them off on time. You're not becoming more and more delinquent on your debts. That'll prop up consumer spending overall for the local economy. And that's good news that the regions that were hardest hit are showing the most improvement, even though they still have a ways to go to match sort of the state level or the U.S. levels overall. And here's the two main drags I talked about in the opening, just housing and government. You can see housing starts are the dark blue line. That's on the left-hand axis. Those have been skyrocketing, double-digit rates from very, very low levels for the last year and a half, and we're projecting that to continue throughout 2013. We're going to see, strong double-digit housing starts growth across the state. And then local government, another year of slow employment, stable employment here for local government state and local government, in the state of Oregon, and then some small positive growth, 1.5 percentage points growth for government. That tends to follow population gains, and so as population continues to expand, we'll have more school teachers, more firefighters, and also some more state agency people such as myself that sort of sit in Salem. So you can laugh at that. So right now, yes, again, the two main drags are starting to lift. We think that'll support growth moving forward. And then this is the brightest point. This is something that we just started to see. Not only is this a colorful graph, it has a very, very important story for the state of Oregon in it. Through the initial phases of the expansion, 2010, 2011, and even in 2012 a little bit, almost all the job growth in the whole state occurred just in the Portland metropolitan area, while if you add up all other counties combined in 2010, 2011, they continued to lose jobs. We're gaining 20,000, 25,000 jobs a year in Portland. Everyone else was stagnating or continuing to lose jobs. So far, or more recently in the last year, year and a half, that has changed. The Portland metropolitan area continues to add jobs at about 2.5 to 3 percentage points in the private sector. Again, that's about 20,000, 25,000 jobs year over year, pretty consistently for the last 3 years. That's very, very good news. But you can see here the reason that the Portland share of the jobs went from 90% down to about 2/3 today at the end of 2012 is because we started to see job growth in other regions of the state, particularly Central Oregon, Willamette Valley, Southern Oregon. We've started to see an increase in jobs. That's the dark blue, the red, and the yellow lines. And that's good news for overall growth for the state now that it's being shared outside of the Portland metropolitan area, because one of the things you need for overall economic growth is the whole state to take part in the expansion. And initially, 2 years ago when we put out the revenue forecast for the state budget for the 2011-13 biennium, I had a relatively local legislator to this region in the state. He literally came up to me and shook me by the shoulders and said, "What recovery are you talking about? I don't see any in my district. You talk about this expansion, these continued jobs and increases and the like." And the truth be told is there was no expansion in a lot of parts of the state a couple of years ago. It was all in the Portland metropolitan area. But now that we're seeing it spread, it's good news. The housing market's coming back, and that's leading a lot of this growth in some of these smaller metropolitan areas and certainly the more rural areas moving forward. In terms of economic issues, so the trends are good. Right now we're starting to improve. We're getting some liftoff across the state, but there still remain a couple major economic reasons or economic issues out there that will weigh on some of the growth we're expected to see. And the first one of those being the long-term unemployed. In this state, we had skyrocketing unemployment rates. We went up to 11%, I believe, at the statewide level. Locally, I think Jackson County hit maybe 12%, and then 12.5%, and then Josephine County hit basically 14%. During the worst of it, it's much, much higher than what we saw at the national level and across many other states, particularly as David was talking about the energy-producing states, the northern Great Plains, or basically the whole middle strip of the country. They did not see the economic cycle that maybe we saw out here, and even more so locally. So we still have about 90,000 Oregonians that have been unemployed for 6 months or longer. That's come down from the 100,000 we had a couple years ago, but there's still a very long way to go before sort of the economy feels like it's back to being at an expansionary territory. The short-term unemployed, the less than 6 weeks, they're kind of sort of back down to the level that we saw before. So we started getting the labor market to function normally for people that were short-term unemployed, but we still have this large swath of the population that were unfortunately laid off, an extended period of time, and they're still struggling to find work. And one of the things this does is it decreases the labor force participation rate. This is very worrisome for a state like Oregon. David talked a lot about, or at least a little bit about migration in the country. We have this southward and westward migration trends in the country, and the state of Oregon has certainly benefited from strong population growth over our existence. And certainly in recent decades, not only have we had strong population growth of young migrant workers, young migrant families, we've also tend to have a higher participation rate. So not only do we have more people and we're growing quicker, we have more people looking for work and producing work and being, productive contributor to the local economy. Well, during the recession, this has certainly plummeted. You can see the trends here. The Oregon Employment Department will be putting out a labor force participation rate. It's a new study that will come out in the next month or so. They were kind enough to share some preliminary results for us, so I'm just borrowing this graph to show how steeply this has fallen. And this is not just in Oregon, it's not just here locally in Medford, it's across the country we've seen this plummet, but it's a little bit more important for Oregon in that, again, we have the stronger population growth and stronger participation rate. To the extent that that doesn't come back, that will act as a weight on growth. But to the extent that it does come back, that we really get a stronger economy, more jobs are continuing to be expanded, we can draw some of these individuals who dropped out back into the labor force, and that's one of the main channels through which we think if we were to get a major upside risk, housing comes back stronger than expected, the energy boom that Lawrence talked about, maybe that produces some more manufacturing jobs than maybe what the baseline scenarios or forecasts call for. We get some of these more upside risks actually come to fruition. We'd actually see an increase in the labor force participation rate, and then we could get to the 3-4% employment growth rates, maybe that we're a little bit used to in this state. If that doesn't come back, it's easy to tell the dark scenario where these individuals are so discouraged by the deep recession and the weak recovery so far that maybe they stay out of the labor force entirely. So these are some of the major issues that we'll watch moving forward as the expansion continues to chug along. The risk to the outlook I'll talk about here in just a second. I think David and Lawrence covered a lot of those pretty well. In terms of our baseline scenario for the state of Oregon, we expect the employment to pick up a little bit. I talked about the 2% growth, that's the red line you see here. Basically, for the last couple of years, we've been saying about mid-2013, we're going to see that pick up in growth rates. And right now, we're sticking with that baseline. Some of the federal sequestration issues that are going on at the national level might weigh a little bit more on this growth than we were originally anticipating. But we're expecting it to pick up, and again, it goes back to the main reasons. We have the housing market certainly improving strongly throughout the state in all locations. We have the stabilization in the public sector, at least the state and local public sector, and then we're getting the geographic spread. That's the biggest thing, right? So Portland alone was contributing to that 2% growth rate we've seen in the state, but now that the rest of the state is picking up in its growth rates overall, we think we can get something about 2.6% employment growth relative to what we've seen. So it should make for a stronger recovery, and again, it'll be more geographically spread out. In terms of the risk, this graph right here comes from the Wall Street Journal Survey of Economic Forecasters. It basically says, what is your GDP forecast, that's the red line, for 2013. You can see for about the last year, it's been pretty stable. Nobody is raising their expectations for the growth rate of the economy, but the green lines are going up. That's the share of the risk to the upside, right? So economists such as you heard this morning, they're saying their sentiment is shifting, right? They're going to stick to their baseline forecast for sort of this slow growth, this mediocre growth, but we think the risks are now more weighted to the upside. And a lot of that has to do with the housing market. That comes back, stronger sales, more increase in new home building activity, and the like. That's where a lot of these upside risks where they voice a lot of these upside risks where we expect to see them. I think this is very important, right? Before you start seeing the stronger growth or before you start raising your forecast, you sort of have to have that sentiment shift. And this is, it's not a hard data thing. It's much more anecdotal, and it's much more of just a storytelling that you hear from people. When we go around the state, when our office goes around the state, we meet with some of the different business groups. We've been out in Astoria, we've been out in Pendleton. This summer we're going to come down to Ashland and do some business tours, I believe. So we get out there, all these different businesses are saying, sales are starting to pick up. We know we're working on our expansion plans. They've started to lay the groundwork for some expansionary things. I think you're seeing that reflected here in this data. That the sentiment is starting to shift from the recessionary mindset, the survival mindset, into the expansionary mindset. And again, it's not a hard data thing, it's a very soft thing, and it's a little hard to quantify, but I think the green bars here do that pretty well. We're starting to see upside risk to the outlook be more substantial than the downside. So I think that alone, if the consumer feels more confident in their personal situation, then they will spend a little bit more, hopefully within their means, so that debt-to-income ratio continues to improve. But the American consumer is a very powerful force, and we expect that to continue moving forward. In terms of the Southern Oregon, like I said, generally when I lump the counties together across the state, I divide them up into 9 different regions. I put Douglas in with Josephine and Jackson. I realize, there's always differences, particularly with Douglas being a little bit more of a timber county than maybe Josephine and Jackson. But I will sort of switch between some of these counties, and I'll make sure to highlight you which one is included when I talk about it. Here is just a 30-40 year time look at employment here in Southern Oregon versus the state of Oregon. The state has vastly outperformed the average state over the cycle. Again, it goes back to our stronger population, our stronger migration, our stronger labor force participation rate. And on top of that, in the 70s and 80s, obviously we had a booming timber economy. In the 90s and 2000s, we've had a booming tech economy, and so that's helped sustain some of these increases. And what you see here with Southern Oregon is they've kept, locally kept right up pace with the state of Oregon, certainly through 2000. I thought, that's very encouraging when you can see some of the smaller areas of the state, population-wise, outperform even the statewide numbers. And that's very good news from an economic development point of view, and obviously a local economic development point of view, excuse me. Since 2000, obviously, it's been a different cycle. There was not much of a tech recession down here. Oregon's bad 2001 recession, again, was pretty much concentrated in the Portland metropolitan area where a lot of the high technology firms are located. And so that dragged down the statewide numbers, whereas the rest of the state did okay during that time period. It was much more like the national recession. You sort of had some flat quarters and some slow growth and the like, but nothing to what we saw with the bursting of the tech bubble in the Bay Area or in the Portland area. And then we saw the strong growth throughout the 2000s with the housing boom and the increase in California migrants up the coast, and then obviously a very, very deep recession. Medford in particular has had basically a top 10% on the upswing during the housing boom, and then a top 10% or bottom 10%, if you will, during the recession and the lackluster recovery we've seen overall since that point in time. So Medford in the last 10 years has been very different than the state overall, and one of the more pronounced cycles across the country. So that's just the 30, 40-year run of employment in the regions. Here again, this recession is currently the worst on historical record. We don't have data going back to the Great Depression, but the state of Oregon's had two major, really dark, really severe recessions. The early 1980s, we had the major restructuring of the timber industry in the state. Not only did the Federal Reserve jack up interest rates and mortgage rates crested at about 18%, I believe, in 1981, excuse me, and that sucked a lot of demand out with a deep national recession. But also, we had the industry itself undergoing a massive restructuring. There's a lot of older mills were coming to the end of their life cycle, so they needed a lot of investment to keep up with new technology. And so we had mergers and buyouts and firms going under and the like, but we also had the reemergence of southern pine, so there's a lot more competition in the marketplace relative to what we produce here. And also we had the introduction of the Canadian lumber. The Canadian logs came on board basically around the same time. So our firms were working with old technology, and they were working or becoming antique technology, and then we had a lot more competition. And so we had a really, really deep early 80s recession. At the statewide level, I think we lost 12.5% of our jobs. And here locally, obviously, you can see is 14.5% of our jobs. So it's a little bit more severe locally. Obviously, it's more timber related in the southern portion of the state than elsewhere. But now, with this current recession, we've surpassed that. Maybe it wasn't quite as deep, but I mean, that's small consolation. And certainly we're seeing, long extended period where job growth has been flat and is down about 12% from the peak during the cycle. And we're just now starting to see over there, you can see around year five of the cycle since employment peaked in the summer of 2007, down here locally, we started to see some increases. So I mean, this is a pretty stark contrast with some of the other regions of the state in terms of getting the job growth, at least so far in this recovery. But there's good news on the horizon, right? We have there's different economic surveys, there's different employment statistics surveys that are out there. And what this shows is there's the CES, the Current Employment survey, which basically is what you read about in the newspaper every single month. The Employment Department, well, now the Bureau of Labor Statistics provides the Oregon numbers for us. That's very kind of them. We no longer do it ourselves at the state of Oregon. But anyway, that's what you see in the newspaper, right? What's the unemployment rate, how many jobs were created and the like. And what you see there is the dark blue line, or the dark blue line for Bend, the dark green line for Medford, and the dark red line for the state of Oregon. That's what you see in the newspaper every single month. Well, there's this other survey, this other employment series called the QCAW, the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. It covers all the people that are covered under the unemployment insurance records. So if you have a job, your employer is going to pay unemployment insurance taxes on your behalf so that if you ever get laid off or your hours get cut enough that it triggers meeting the qualifications, you can go get your unemployment benefits, right? And that's a much more complete count. It's not a survey-based. It's not a sample-based survey that then they blow up and try and talk about it. And so during times of economic transitions, right, moving into recession or moving into expansion and the like, when you do a small sample survey and blow it up to the whole population, you can create some data issues. But all this is to say is that this more complete count of employment, particularly in Bend and Medford, shows much stronger job gains than what you read in the newspaper every single month. We find that very encouraging. When the employment department goes through next year and benchmarks, when they revise all their employment data, the dark green lines are going to look a lot closer to the light green line here for Medford. And basically what that means is that, Medford private sector lost 14% of their jobs during this recession. It's much more severe than the average county here in the state of Oregon. It's much more severe than the nation overall, certainly. But you can see based on that light green line, job growth has been pretty strong in the last year. We're talking 5% or so within the last year. Since last summer, during David's presentation, he talked about the improving index for the home builders. We looked at all the different metro areas in the country, and he said that Medford's been positive since January, right? Well, you do the math on that and you back up, that means, well, the housing improvement began in July, and sure enough, you can see, since early 2012, we started to see job growth locally. It's really picked up since last summer. That's matching the housing cycle a little bit. Housing's certainly fueling the growth locally, and the timing sort of matches up there. I found that interesting. Just for another point, Bend is doing even a little bit better, right? Bend lost 19% of their jobs, which is one of the largest cycles, again, in the country. Medford is about the 10th percentile in terms of the cycle. Bend was more like the 2nd percentile. There's only a couple cities, a couple metropolitan areas across the country that had a more pronounced business cycle than the Bend area. They're up about 5.5% from their bottom, whereas Medford is about 5, Bend's 5.5. And so now that we're getting some of these good-sized metropolitan areas in the state partaking in the expansion, from my vantage point in Salem, looking at the state data and the national data, this is very, very encouraging for the state of Oregon to get this type of growth. In terms of housing locally, this is housing permits. This will eventually get turned into new construction. It doesn't get turned into new construction overnight, obviously, as you guys all know. After 3-4 years of really low, stable levels of permits, it started to increase in 2012, and in the early months of 2013, it started to increase a little bit stronger. I believe in the last year, permits up about 40% for Medford. Single-family permits up about 40%. That's the same as the state. The state's up 40%. It's really strong growth. It's a little bit faster than the U.S. overall, so it's encouraging, again, for future business activity. It's basically the same level during this recession. I have a great state chart I didn't bring with me today. We had a strong housing, not necessarily a bubble, but we had a strong housing boom in the late 70s in the state of Oregon and in Washington, state of Washington for that matter. You overlay the 1970s through the 80s when we had that major deep recession here in the state. With what we saw during 2005 through today, you just overlay those on top of each other. They're nearly identical, and it's a little bit, it's a very interesting thing to think about. You can see it here, basically, 2009's back to 1982 levels. You can kind of visualize those being the same. The population was a third smaller than it is today. Talking about the strong population growth, both locally and in the state of Oregon, we had 1.1 million less people back then in the state of Oregon. And locally, you do the math, I think it's about 70,000 people in Jackson County. We have about 200,000 people here today. Back then we had 130,000 people. So you think about the same level of new home construction today, or a couple years ago, as when the population was a third smaller back in the early 80s. So the collapse of the housing sector during the Great Recession is a very interesting phenomenon from a macroeconomic point of view. But we're starting to see that turnaround and an increase in activity levels across the board. Home prices, this again, I believe both David talked about home prices a lot, and so did Lauren, so I don't want to talk too much about them. But the local government individuals here, you guys will recognize what the red line is. Basically, that's a naive compression line for property tax reasons. You go back to 1996, you take off 10%, and then property taxes can only grow by 3% a year. And this is just, really basic line on that. You can see how divorced the real market value from the assessed market value was for homes for here in Medford, and we're pretty much all the way back down to where we were if we just would have, had constant home price increases at the rate of inflation, more or less. I think, it's always an interesting thing. Bend's the exact same way. You can do some of the other metropolitan areas in the state, and you can actually get them below what that naive compression line would be. Salem, I believe, is that way. So, that produces all sorts of constraints on the local governments, the county budgets in particular. It's an interesting comparison to have. But even with all these housing things turning around, right? The economy's turning around. We're gaining jobs across the whole swath of industries. When you look at the Medford data, I believe you're getting some trade, transportation, warehousing jobs. We're getting some manufacturing employment. We're getting the housing jobs, and then the health jobs. Obviously, you know, healthcare is a bigger sector down here than maybe in some of the surrounding communities. With all that being said, things are turning around, but not everything's looking great. Demographics are not in our favor. David talked a lot about the home buying age, the percentage of the population, the echo baby boomers are moving into their purchasing years or their household formation years. And that's going to be very good for the housing sector, but overall, we're aging quite substantially as a country, and certainly here locally. You can see this talks about population growth in the state of Oregon. The red part is the natural increase. That's the number of births minus the number of deaths. You know, how much is the population increasing on its own versus the net migration? Historically, net migration has been about 2/3 of population growth in the state of Oregon. 1/3 of it's been natural increase, but you can see pretty soon the red area is declining and the red area is going to turn negative pretty soon, and that just has to do with just the general demographics. And so we'll be solely reliant upon net migration to grow the population, and we need to grow the population to have continued economic growth, and again, it's really important to our state. And these trends are even a little more pronounced locally, right? You know, Jackson County, the net migration was basically zero in the last decade. It's been a lot of, population, or net migration was the component of population growth that we saw. It's going to turn negative next decade. In Josephine County, it's actually been decrease in the natural population, the natural increase for quite a few decades now, and been relying upon the influx of migrants to add to the jobs. And this is more pronounced within the more rural and the smaller communities in the state than it is in the larger metropolitan areas. You know, the Portland, you look at this for Portland, or you look at, the age pyramid for Portland, it looks a little bit more sustainable over time, just given the, the younger demographics that are there, the Portlandia crowd, right? You move when you're 20, 22 years old, you're unemployed, and you just graduated with your sociology degree, you move to Portland, right? It does help with some of these demographics. And moving forward, the demographic concerns are pretty big in this state, particularly on the southern coast. The southern coast has the most pronounced changing demographics, aging demographics, if you will, and then out east they're having some more as well. So Medford's certainly not the worst. Medford proper, is a lot better than maybe some of the surrounding communities down here. And I think, it's not always the easiest thing to talk about. But moving forward for economic growth, it is certainly an important thing to do. So we need to continue to invest in our communities, increase transportation access, increase our education opportunities to work on educating our workforce and our youth, and even providing retraining opportunities for the people, maybe mid-career that got laid off during the recession. Make sure that there are proper opportunities for them to retrain for an available job. And that should help increase and sustain some of the smaller regions of the state. And I think, it's something that's on the state legislators' minds. We know that. They're always asking about this, what can we do to help that so that the young migrants don't all move to the cities, right? Eugene, Salem, Portland. I actually have a slide about that right here. So net migration is very important for the state of Oregon, and maybe a little bit more here locally. So where do they come from? I hit something. Thank you. Where do they come from? They come from California. You talk about this westward and southern migration in the country overall, and that certainly is a multi-generational, long-term trend we're seeing. But what's a little bit funny is on the West Coast, explicitly, we have a northern migration, right? All the Californians move to Oregon, and then all the Oregonians move to Washington. And I think it kind of stops there. I don't think they're going up to Vancouver, up to BC, but we sort of have this northerly flow. And in the state of Oregon, we get the vast majority of our population increases, our migrants, from the state of California, and even more so locally. You can see here, I've converted some recent IRS tax return data on migration into percentage of the population. The red bar for California locally is a little bit bigger than the state overall, so maybe, you get a little bit more dependent upon the California migrant. And then just like the state overall, local people move to Vancouver. There's about over 1/3 of that is Vancouver. I always think about Vancouver, Washington, that is just across the river from Portland, as being more of a Portland phenomenon, right? Like you have a small business, you want to avoid capital gains, you go over there and you sell it. There's some tax advantages of doing that. I don't think anyone's trying to hide that fact. But you're moving, from the other end of the state just to this, just to the other side of Portland. I thought that was interesting that the same patterns occur occur throughout the state. The Vancouver phenomenon isn't just a Portland metropolitan area thing, but it is truly a statewide migratory pattern. And then the rest of them go up to basically the Puget Sound region. And then the only major difference here is the all other. The state of Oregon, we get most of them from California. We lose to Washington. We actually lose to Idaho a little bit as well. But then every other state on net sort of sends just a little bit of their population to Oregon each and every year. The opposite is true more locally, right? You lose just a little bit of the population everywhere. So that's really the only fundamental difference in the migration patterns. And then within the state migration, as I was highlighting or referring to just a minute ago, Portland and then the Willamette Valley more generally are attracting migrants within the state, right? So some local residents here are moving to, not really Eugene anymore. Eugene was much more of a decade ago. We saw some more people moving to Eugene, but to Salem in particular, which perplexes me, right? Never mind, why would you move to Salem? But Portland, right? Portland's drawing from every individual region of each region of the state, and that's just, it continues to funnel. The rich get richer, if you will. The Washington County folks, they have Intel, they have Nike, they're getting all the population growth, they're getting all the job growth. That is really where the economic hub of the state has been in the last 10 years, and it's no surprise, right? People want to move to where the jobs are. So these trends aren't surprising, but they are sustaining. I thought maybe we'd get some sort of breakdown during this housing downturn. People getting locked in their homes, people couldn't move, and it's true. The migratory flows are down. We're getting less people from California, less people from Colorado, and the like. But the patterns have stayed the same, right? So the patterns here, this is only 0.2% of the population each year on average. We're getting from California. It would be 2, 3, 4 times that large if we go back a decade, or 2005, 2006. So the flows are down quite a bit, but the patterns have stayed the same. And again, that's very encouraging from population growth, from an economic development point of view. From our vantage point, from my office's vantage point, is that the patterns have remained. We haven't fundamentally broken our patterns of stronger population growth. It's just the flows are down given the lackluster economic environment everybody is finding themselves in. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about, I have a couple minutes. I just want to talk a little bit about the local economy, right? I mentioned earlier, Douglas County is more of a timber county, and it certainly is. In the state of Oregon, we used to have 70, 80,000 wood products jobs. These are not including paper mills. These are not including log truckers. These are just, these are basically lumber mills, and these are loggers is what this is. We used to have a substantial number of them, 70, 80,000 on a regular basis. The wood products industry itself used to be 13% of the GDP back in the 70s. These jobs also paid 35% above the state average back during that time. So not only do we have, tens and thousands of them, and they were concentrated mostly in the southern quadrant of the state, or the southwestern quadrant of the state. They paid really well, and they were a good source of our economic growth. Obviously, you can see the early 80s recession there in the middle took about 10, 15,000 of that. Coming out of that, we had more productive mills, so they didn't require as many people, even if the number of board feet that were being processed through them and their contribution to the economy was the same. We didn't need quite as many jobs just due to automation, and that's a long-term cycle trend that is occurring with automation within the mills. And then obviously, the 90s, the environmental decisions has sort of sent the industry on a tailspin for decades, and that's a policy choice that I don't want to get into. I'm not here to discuss the environmental choices that are made at the state and the federal level, but you can see, this is a source, and it's more pronounced. It's obviously the footprint of the timber industry is in southwestern Oregon. And you can see right here, we went from 80,000 jobs, and now we're down to around 20, 25,000 jobs once you include the logging and some of the miscellaneous manufacturing. The reason there's different lines is there's a historical break in the data. They switch systems and classifying where people are employed in the different industries. So that's why you see that break there in the 1990s. But these jobs have started to turn around a little bit, right? We've added a couple thousand in the last couple years. I think we're up to 28,000. The red line's up to 28,000, up from 26,000. So, I mean, we started to add them a little bit, but the automation in the mills continues to be really, really productive, really pronounced. And so even if we were to go back to the level of logging and timber harvest that we saw previously, the same number of jobs wouldn't come back. We're not going to get back to 80,000, but I do think, if we increase the logging and whatnot, then we would get some more jobs. And again, it has a more pronounced effect down here in this region of the state. And so, when you're restructuring this, you lose this industry, right? Basically through competition and automation, and then also policy decisions that are made. We're losing this industry, which was the bread and butter for the whole state of Oregon for a long time. What do you do? What do you do to replace it? How do you go about doing that? And the important, back up just a second, the importance of timber and agriculture in the state of Oregon will never go away completely. I know, we have good wheat growing land out east. We have the Willamette Valley that's very, very fertile. You can grow basically any crop you want. And down here we still have a plethora of trees that will be continued to log, and I think our federal representatives are working on increasing some of that to support not only the healthy forest, but also some of the jobs. But, so the importance of these industries will never go away completely. I would never say that, but where do you go, right? We've had this long transition as a U.S. economy from manufacturing into services, and it's taken decades and decades and decades, and this just shows locally versus the state, where we've seen some job growth. Josephine, Jackson, Douglas, Lane counties. I sort of put the Josephine, Jackson juxtaposed to Douglas, Lane because that's, there's more timber jobs in Douglas, Lane. That's the true heart of the industry for the state of Oregon. But you can see, obviously, this is a bad decade across the board. Bookend by recessions. We had the tech recession or the dot-com recession, 2001, and then obviously the Great Recession in this one. So you look at the total jobs over on the left, basically zero. We've gained no jobs over a decade. But without these services you see on the right, they'd be much more severe. Obviously, construction, manufacturing, transportation, and the like had a really, severe recession in the last couple years, but we've still managed to add jobs, professional business services, education and health in particular here locally. One of the things that you always hear, not necessarily just state advisors, but national advisors. When you lose your dominant industry, when you lose your timber mill in your town, what are you supposed to do? Well, the answer is, well, you're supposed to become a tourism hub or try and get some of the medical information, right? Well, not everywhere can be a tourism hub. I think we're pretty honest about that. Bend will always be, the tourism hub, just given their facilities they have there at the ski slopes and the like. And the coast has a lot of attractive tourism, natural beauty, and the like. But not everywhere can be a tourism hub. Ashland's done a good job, obviously, and they have the university down there. There's a little bit, the university here has a campus and the community college, but really the health, right? Medford has done a really good job of being the healthcare hub, sort of Southern Oregon. There's the VA hospital not far out as well. And so really, you look at Southern Oregon, Joseph and Josephine counties, and people say, what are you supposed to do when you lose manufacturing? Well, done a really good job of rebalancing the economy, I must say. Much better than some of the other regions of the state. And part of that is this larger population, Medford being the largest city down here, and basically the largest city between, Lawrence and Dave and I were trying to talk about this, basically Sacramento to Eugene, Medford is the biggest city in between that, right? So, naturally you're going to be a hub for migrants and a hub for the medical activity, and that's really important moving forward, particularly with the aging population. So this is just to show that, the importance of the natural resources will never go away. The state of Oregon is blessed with a lot of opportunities in that regard. Whether we're taking advantage of them is a different issue, but the service sector has continued to grow quite strongly at the state level and certainly locally. And then moving forward for the outlook, this is a state and a local outlook. The return of migrants, right? As the housing sector comes back, people are no longer underwater in their mortgage. They're feeling more confident in their situation. They're going to move for more job opportunities. The return of migration is going to be great for the state of Oregon. Also, the return of housing. I put manufacturing both on the good and the bad, right? We're going to get some bounce. The mills are starting to operate at a higher capacity than they have been in recent years, even with the recent announcement. I know the last mill in Josephine County is closing this week or next week. I realize that, but the ones that are still there, they're number quite a few less than they used to, obviously, but they are starting to work at longer hours, more shifts, and the like. So it is a good short-term phenomenon, but long-term, manufacturing will not provide the boost that we're used to in recent decades, or certainly over the last 50 years. And then the service industries, the ones I just talked about, that's where a lot of the growth is going to be in the U.S. economy from an employment perspective as well. And so locally, the same sort of patterns should emerge. And then some of the restraining growth is the demographics, right? We're going to get the migrants. Hopefully we're going to get some young migrants, some young families or near family age migrants. Hopefully they're college educated as well. You know, that's ideally what we're looking for to help support some innovation and some long-term growth for the state. But the aging and the labor force participation rate are likely to remain drags on the overall outlook. And then locally, government replacing timber payments. The most recent vote for Josephine County obviously was to the negative on putting in a public service levy, and I know there's been a number of the votes down in the timber counties, so that's going to be a challenge for, obviously it's a challenge for this region in the state. Not only, you know, we had the declining timber industry due to some federal policies. Now the federal policies are saying, well, we'll no longer replace some of the revenue you lost from the old 25% fund during higher timber harvest levels. And so, you know, that will remain a unique challenge. And I know the state has a couple task force on it that are working on some sort of solutions. And I don't know what the end result is going to be. And like I said, the federal legislators from the state are working on some different harvest solutions. And it's a big challenge, particularly for the governments, obviously, because they're the ones who receive the direct money. In the short term, that is going to restrain growth until some sort of permanent solution is worked out. And with that, that's all I have for prepared remarks. I will just highlight a couple things. Social media, we have a blog as well, OregonEconomicAnalysis.wordpress.com. That's where you'll find all the information you've seen today. Almost all of that's on there at one time or another. And then locally, I would highlight the employment department, right? QualityInfo.org. The employment department has boots on the ground across the state. And here locally, you got a couple great ones with Guy and with Nora. I believe I have trouble saying her name, but you know, they're on the ground, they're doing lots of work, and they're doing lots of research and analysis. You go to that website, there's a little map up in the right-hand corner with different regions of the state. You just click on whichever region of the state you want to find information about, and they take you to this page. Everything you want to know about Medford jobs and employment and income and the likes right there. More statewide stuff and some regional stuff. I'd say check us out, but stay on top of the local stuff, go to the employment department. And that's all I had prepared.
I'll tell you what, in my experience with this type of event, some of the best stuff is about to happen from here. We're going to invite the panelists to come up right now. We have some questions prepared. We will give you an opportunity to ask some questions as well. I've got a qualifier here. Now, this is going to be predominantly a moderated Q&A session, but if time allows, and I'm going to do my best to create that, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. Now, if we do that and your question is addressed to one of the county commissioners, the question must be limited to their thoughts on today's information. If a question is asked of one of them about something specific they are currently working on, they will be required to decline to answer because that would fall under a public meeting and corresponding notification requirements, yada, yada, yada. The panel members, Dr. Yoon, you want to, what are you going to do?
Sorry, I have a conference call that just came in. It's only brief, 5 minutes, so I will be back here at 12:05.
We'll listen in. I think it would be interesting. No, all right, we won't listen in, but we'll start without you. Dr. Crow, Josh is going to be here. Don Skundrick, Jackson County Commissioner. Doug Breedenthal, also Jackson County Commissioner. Cheryl Walker, who has the unenviable position right now, Josephine County Commissioner. And Brad Hicks, the CEO of the Medford-Jackson County Chamber of Commerce. Well, actually, Dr. Yoon, that's very convenient timing because my first question was for him. But I'll open it up to the other, actually, just to anybody who would like this. What have we learned? You know, Medford's in a great position right now. We're seeing that we're poised for continued growth. That's good, but what do we know from the lessons learned over the last several years? Are we heading for another bubble? Dr. Yoon addressed that a little bit. What precautions are there? But I think I would love to hear from the economists first. How is it different now than what you thought 5 years ago, and how will it be different in the future?
Well, I'll take the first opportunity and steal Lawrence's thunder since he left. I agree with Dr. Yoon on this point. We're not headed for a bubble. That doesn't mean we won't ultimately make some mistakes in the future. We do quickly forget, and I'm using collectively we. But But the real principle here is the ultimate driver of house prices is how much does it cost to replace a house? How much does it cost to add to the stock? Because that's what we ultimately have to do. We have to keep adding to the stock because of the growth in the population. So that's kind of a dictator both on the up and the down side. And as I think Lawrence appropriately reflected, the cost of building a house is dictated by the cost of the individual materials. There's no reason to believe those are going to fall. If anything, they're going to rise as we try to garner back those resources from wherever they went. So house prices are still well below where they were if you look at the path they were on, say, from the 80s and 90s. No question we had a bubble, we had extreme values, but we're not anywhere near getting back to that longer-term sustainable path. So I think we're a long way from worrying about a bubble.
Was it recognized as a bubble back in the day?
No, of course not.
By economists?
It's a hindsight reflection.
Hindsight's very good.
Yeah. Everything was fine during the bubble.
Yes. And actually, we had, I believe, 1,150 licensed realtors, and it dropped to about 700. Josh, we know that the builders population, also there was a tremendous attrition. Where did those people go? I met, contractors who were building fences because that's the work that was available. Have you seen a lateral shift or going to other jobs in the process, or have they migrated to where the work is out of state? And we should have a microphone for you somewhere.
I think my Taiwan is working. Sounds like it. One of the things we've seen, I'm not sure about some of the business owners per se. We have not seen. First of all, I'll back up. Right, we lost 30-40% of our construction jobs, and we have seen basically a non-ending decline in the number of the individuals employed in the real estate sector, the economy. I heard earlier from Gino in a conversation that the number of licensed realtors in the state has stabilized. When I look at some of the real estate data in terms of the people that work in the industry overall, whether it's licensed agents or what have you, that has not stopped declining really. So that decline is ongoing. But where did they go? One of the things we've seen is that some of the laborers have shifted over to the oil fields and the natural gas fields, right? I have friends. I have a friend who runs a construction company, a big manufacturing company in Colorado. All his workers left to go to Montana and North Dakota during the recession because that's where the jobs were, right? It's still generally manual labor, and sure, there's specialized skills, but it did transition more quickly than moving to nursing or something like that.
All right, good. Let's engage the county commissioners. Cheryl, I'm going to have to start with you. I don't know what Wednesday morning was like for you, but another public service levy went down. It wasn't a huge margin. That impressed me how close the vote was. I suppose there's one positive in that you continue to have the lowest tax rates in the state. But I took a call last week from a client who said he was looking for 5 acres. He was unable to find something in Jackson County, and he found something in Josephine County. But he's from out of state. He heard a little bit about the police levy, the lack of sheriff's protection. They're letting the criminals out. Is that having an impact, do you think, on your economy?
Is this microphone? Oh, I can hear it. Yes, Wednesday morning was interesting. We had our weekly business session at 9 o'clock Wednesday morning. So just having had the news the night before and then going into a meeting the next day was quite interesting. And then later in the afternoon, we had a budget hearing. So a lot of people are saying it's a lot of doom and gloom and things are really bad. What are we going to do? But I look at this as another milestone along the way because we're not going to stop just because we lost one vote by 539 votes. We're going to continue to move forward. I have a lot of confidence in the economy. I was looking at the statistics here in this presentation today, and a lot of that is what I have been reading, that our private sector in Josephine County is making that same slow recovery as it is in any other county that we've talked about today. The government sector, even though Mr. Lehner said today that the government sectors have kind of leveled off, I think the government sector in Josephine County is still going to take a hit. This next year is not going to be positive in our county government. We are still going to see a lot of readjustment in our county. As to how that affects the development in our county, as you have seen for many, many years, we have had to rely on the in-migration of people in our county. We actually have empty classrooms in a lot of our schools, and we are just now closing another school in our county district because the younger population has continued to decline rather drastically. So what we're looking at is a growth in the private economy of the people moving in here, most of them retirees from other areas. However, we do have an in-migration of some people who are coming there who are not retired but own businesses somewhere else. In fact, 17 to 18% of our property owners in Josephine County live out of state, or excuse me, out of county, not entirely out of state. So when they don't even live in the area permanently but own property there, that tells me that they are still going to come there, they're still going to be consumers in our county. Our private sector economy will make some adjustments for that. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the area of growth for those industries that are related not just to service and medical, but to those that the occupations or the pastimes that seniors are active in. We have a bicycle shop that recently opened. I don't ride bicycles, but I tell you, some of the people that are riding bicycles are my age and older, and I see them wanting to do some competition. So I see some interest in very active seniors. So I think that's going to open some areas for businesses. As to the housing, I call them the very large homes that some of these people have come here and purchased and built. And I'm seeing them wanting to downsize, as am I. You know, when you have a big house and having to take care of that big house, when there's only you or one other person having to do it, I think that what I see in the future in Josephine County, perhaps in the housing market, is more of the smaller houses. I've talked to some people who have come here and said, you know, I've been looking at a lot of houses, but, you know, I just want 2,500 square feet. You know, I'm seeing a lot of homes out there that are lovely homes, so I think that's an opportunity as well. I think that our housing market and those who are in the construction business are going to look to that as well. I'd like to say, too, that just this last month, we actually had a subdivision application in our planning department. I think that's the first one in several years. It's a small subdivision, but we have one. So that's good to see. And we also, excuse me, have had a little bit of an uptick on some of the permits as well. So I think that our private economy is going to follow the state trend as well. Thank you.
Very good. Jackson County Commissioners, Doug, Don, do you guys have?
Jump first, or? Always leave it to the new guy. You know, basically, who's been following the newspaper and everybody's seeing all of the reductions in county expenditures, not only in Jackson, Josephine, Curry, Douglas, Lane. It's across the board. It's a regional issue. A lot of people will say, I mean, how many people in the room, raise your hand, literally, would say government has a spending problem? Okay. Well, I can tell you, being a new commissioner here in Jackson County and looking at the way Jackson County's run, I would actually argue that at this point in time. I've been in private industry and I've worked for the state for over 20 years. Now, I would agree the state has a spending problem. But I would also say that Jackson County is probably one of the best well-run counties I've seen in a long time working from the inside. With that being said, I will say a lot of the revenue problem that we are having right now is a direct result of timber. And I think a lot of that was outlined here recently in the slideshow that we were just watching. And tens of millions of dollars reduction on an annual basis just on O&C receipts. That's a large statement. So what I can say today is Jackson County is actually running and providing the same level of service at the same level that they did in 2006, but they don't have that revenue. So they're actually being very, very cognizant of the fact that they just don't have the money. And Josephine County is doing a lot of the same things. If we look at the short-term solution, yes, timber. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That is the direct effect of Measure 550 and the O&C Act and everything like that. We need to increase timber harvest. And we've been working diligently here on a national basis here recently. We were back in D.C. lobbying. And Senator Wyden is coming out with his release here very shortly if he hasn't already. He'll be talking about what he's going to be doing. Merkley, DeFazio, Walden, Schrader bill is out there also. I would encourage the federal side, as it was addressed earlier, to really address these things and take that into consideration. We are seeing an uptick in some of our local work here, and I see housing starts on a little bit of a rise. Now, with that being said about timber, what are we going to do for the future? How are we going to make sure long-term sustainability is really in place? And how are we going to bridge the gap on some of our workforce as we talk about migrants coming, migrant populations trying to serve that development? Some of the things that Jackson County just did yesterday is we just enacted an ordinance and approved it yesterday to invoke a constitutional provision which allows for our inmates to be used in the private sector. Now, there might be a little bit of concern, oh no, the county's going to compete in the private sector. The commissioners are going to monitor that very, very closely. If there's work out there to be done that people need the employees to go do the work, but nobody's bidding on the jobs, it doesn't serve anybody any good. But yet now the county can come in there, provide the inmates that the citizens of the state of Oregon wanted back in 1994 to allow that service to be back at a very reasonable rate for the community. So, but at the same time, if there's multiple bids on something, we're not going to put the inmates out there. And I think those are things that we can do today. We can also look, okay, what are we going to do for high-tech development here in Jackson County? And I like to brag on things that we're doing, not things that we can potentially do. In the last week, we received, it was last week or two, Don, on the e-commerce? Last week. Yeah. We received an e-commerce overlay for our enterprise zones. So that's going to do a really good job for allowing businesses to receive a little bit of economic advantage on taxation so that they can expand their business and move forward, moving into the high-tech industry. Recognizing that timber is not the only thing out there, but frankly, we have to be looking to the future to make sure that we get out of the way to let government be, private sector be successful. No pun intended, sorry. The government will be successful as a result of the private industry being successful. So I don't want to get too deep into this.
What was the question again?
Yeah. So, as far as the impact of how important housing is, you know, and certainly looking at timber, and this entire economy has been changing. So how are we doing, and how are we preparing?
Well, someone who's lived here for several years and went through the 80s, early 80s recession, and being from the construction industry myself, you know, I thought that was as black a days as I would ever see. In fact, when things were going well, I can remember saying if things got too well, I could just think about 81 and bring me back to earth, because I never thought I'd ever see it again. But obviously, this second great recession has, and the biggest issue, and I apologize for being late this morning, because we had a commissioners meeting, so I wasn't able to hear our economists, so they probably talked about this. Of course, the big difference this year, or this recession, over the previous one in the 80s is it's so much longer. And as we saw the one graph there presented, our unemployment is, you know, you saw a rebound, 83, 85, 80, 87. You haven't seen that. But anyway, but speaking about construction, and in my past experience, in the 80s, everybody went to Texas. All of my customers, or not all of my customers, many of my customers, and went to Texas because that's where the oil money was, and that's where the jobs were at. And now, as has been already mentioned, Cheryl mentioned, or someone mentioned earlier, now they're going to Bakken in Dakota, North Dakota, and eastern Montana for the energy there. I mean, that's not unusual. People are going to go where the jobs go. One thing concerns me with housing, related to housing, though, is that on one hand, and I know I'm probably speaking to mainly realtors here, and as we talk about increased housing prices and how good that is and such, is that we have it creates a dichotomy. Because as we try to bring those young folks in, that was mentioned earlier by the previous speaker, we got to realize we got to be able to put them up. They got to be able to afford a home, and that's always been a concern of mine, because our county average wage is $34,000. And do the math on that, and that's the reason why obviously there's so many dual working households or more trying just to make ends meet. And so that's a real concern of mine, is attracting younger folks. I can say that because I'm an older folk, but attracting younger folks, but being able to then find them a job, number one, that pays sustainable family wage jobs. That's number one priority. but then so they can afford to buy houses and build houses and buy houses from you folks and such. So that's what I see in the construction industry and how it's impacted here, especially here in Jackson County.
Good. Brad Hicks, you're plugged into the business community maybe more than almost anybody. Well, first, I'm kind of curious, is it the tail wagging the dog? Do the businesses come and set up shop and then expect the customers to arrive, or are you seeing more businesses develop as a result of other factors? But what are your chamber members talking to you about as far as their current concerns and what they see as needing to be done for growth in the future?
Well, I've learned a couple of things this morning. One is I often get accused of doing the most talking, and so if you want to be the guy that talks the least, surround yourself with politicians and economists, and you're going to look pretty good. So I'm gonna make sure that we actually get out of here on time. I'll be pretty brief. I think you heard this morning a lot of the things that our members are saying to us validated from our two economists. Access to capital continues to be a big challenge. And I don't want to give away some of my other answers to some of the other questions, but maybe I'll allude to it and just say, so I'll repeat it later, and say confidence is a big factor. I like seeing all the positive upward trends, but I also think that we have to be careful. One of the things that happens all too often, and I worked in Salem for 3 legislative sessions, so I've seen it before. I don't say that because I've just been picking that up in the Mail Tribune from Greg. I say that because I've seen it. We have one little uptick in good news, and instead of saying, you know, we're still climbing our way out of this tough time, elected officials say, let's spend it. In fact, if we have a revenue forecast that says we're $270 million above where we projected, let's spend that and let's double down. Let's go $500 million. So I hear members say that we don't have confidence in state and federal government. Now, we did just poll our membership recently, and over 20% of our members responded, so pretty significant number of local folks. And they did feel like our city and county governments were very business friendly. So hats off to these guys and their colleagues and the folks at City Hall. The same could not be said for the folks in Salem and Washington, D.C. I'm still trying to find the 7% that think Congress is doing a good job.
We won't ask for a show of hands here, but I am going to ask for a show of hands. If you have a question that you would like for somebody from the panel, we're just going to let you shout it out, and I suspect that your hearing is as good or better than mine. I saw a hand back here. If you wouldn't mind standing, identifying yourself, please. Whoever wants to, actually, yeah, you're back. Yeah.
So, you know, one could use either various metrics, say home value to income, home values to rent. One could use the affordability, taking into account of the low mortgage rates and so forth. And most metric is implying that it is actually 10 or 15% overcorrection. In fact, the British weekly publication, The Economist, who actually predicted that there was a U.S. housing market bubble and it's going to end badly, was implying that right now U.S. real estate is 10 to 15% undervalued in relation to their fundamental metrics. So that's where we are.
10 to 15% undervalued. I have a couple clients I'm going to be talking to this afternoon. Just want to attribute that, Dr. Yoon. Thank you very much. Other questions that we haven't asked yet? All the way back. Okay, the question's about shadow inventory. Does it exist? I have heard some conflicting things. I've heard rumors and innuendo, but when I've talked to experts, I'm curious, as experts, what your opinion or experience is for the so-called shadow inventory.
Just to have my time back, sorry for being
No,
late.
bring it on.
I did actually have one slide there, but I did go very fast on it. So if one looks at the seriously delinquent mortgages, and one would presume that since they have not paid their mortgage payment for more than 3 months or 6 months, that somehow it will go into foreclosure at some point. In California, the figure was about 12% at the peak. Oregon was 6%. Today, Oregon is still at 6%. California has come down to 5%. And the difference is that in California, you don't pay your mortgage, the person gets evicted. Now, they're trying to stop that with new legislation, but they did not have that legislation when the process. But in Oregon, it's a judicial foreclosure process, so it has to go to the court system. And the judges of the court generally tend to be more sympathetic to distressed homeowners rather than to the banks. They're holding back the shadow. So one can say that there is shadow in Oregon, only 6% of the mortgages, but nonetheless, it's not falling, say, like in California market, where it has rapidly fallen.
I agree with Lawrence on that point. I would add the fact that the resolution, or the workout of this agreement that the state's attorney generals have made with the federal government hasn't really completely come into effect. So that could have an ameliorating factor on those mortgages that are underwater, giving some of those borrowers at least an opportunity to remain in place. This is really, it's only the ones that ultimately end up in a foreclosure and therefore an empty house that provide a threat to prices and to excess supply. You know, I'd also emphasize what the point I made was that although it's still elevated in Oregon, it isn't as bad as it is in many other, but half of the states are worse than Oregon. And half of the foreclosures are only in 5 states, and Oregon is not one of those. So it is, continues to be an overhang to the overall housing market, but it isn't nearly as dangerous here as it is in most places.
Now, is the shadow inventory, it sounds like, Dr. Yoon, your slide was just identifying folks who are delinquent in making the payment. What I've heard, a definition for shadow inventory are homes that have already been foreclosed, that the bank is keeping in reserve because they don't want to gut or glut, create a glut.
Yeah, that's right. That's the full definition, and the 6% would include that, the homes already in the foreclosure process. So 6% of the mortgages in Oregon are in the shadow, seriously delinquent or in the foreclosure process. Other states have seen that figure decline, but not in Oregon. Oregon still remains at 6% of mortgages in that category.
So this is not necessarily homes that have been foreclosed upon or sitting vacant, and the bank is just waiting for a better economic wave before they put it on the market necessarily.
In fact, nearly all banks would say that amount of foreclosed property they're holding back is zero. The only reason they may be holding back is they need to assure that all the documents are proper, so that may be the only reason, but at least when we talk to the banks, they are saying that there's no reason to hold back. It's just better to sell it rather than carry the cost.
Yeah,
so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, and in fact, as prices increase, that argument makes even less sense, that there isn't really any underlying business reason why banks would be holding back. I think that's a fiction that nobody wants to step up and say it's false. I'll say it's false.
Okay, all right, good, thank you. Here is a question that was prepared in advance, and I'll put it to all of the panelists. Is home ownership still an appropriate investment vehicle? Now, since investment interest is at near record lows as far as interest rates, should we be promoting home and property acquisition as an investment vehicle? I'm also curious, related question, to time frames. How long can someone anticipate, or should they be anticipating? Obviously, age is going to dictate that, but what kind of time frames? You know, if you're a day trader, you're going to freak out every day, and if you're watching the short-term graph, but on the long range, is there a consensus of opinion up here on whether investing in real estate is a good investment vehicle? compared to some of the alternatives. Josh, go ahead. Will you grab the mic? Oh, thank you. Well, it'll be stereo that way.
Okay. Let's see. I think overall, I think it still is. We have a Governor's Council of Economic Advisors that has a number of housing dominated industry representatives on it, whether they're consultants or what have you. And they have a very pessimistic view of it overall over the 10-year horizon, right? You know, typically prior to the bubble, you'd get some national research shows that home prices rise just a little bit above inflation, right? You know, overall, David mentioned about the replacement cost also being a fundamental driver there, but you know, home prices tend to rise a little bit faster than the rate of inflation, and that's what our forecast calls for going forward. Obviously, in the near term, we're getting these really strong price appreciations. We have this, in our heads, economists have this magical view of the world where supply and demand always sort of move in equilibrium and you get these nice steady increases. That's clearly not happening with the lack of supply on the market right now, so we're getting these huge price increases way above the rate of inflation. So over the long term, we think they'll revert closer to back to, you know, the 2.5%, 3%, maybe 4% range, but in the near term, they're stronger. Overall, as a financial investment, I think that depends. It depends upon what the younger generations are going to be doing in terms of their careers. Are they going to be more mobile? If they're moving from region to region of the country, then maybe on a horizon, then maybe home ownership isn't for them, just because the transactions costs are so large, the closing documents. Being a good government worker myself, you know, I'm stable in my situation, so I bought a home, you know, so I'm not going to be moving anytime soon, but that's just more a stereotype in my industry, but yeah, I think, yeah, I'll say that.
I did some research on past regional bubbles. So we've had this happen before. We've never had it happen on a national scale, but we've had it happen in individual markets, the tech bubble, the oil bust in Texas. And so in every case, we had declines in house prices, and then we had declines following that in home ownership rates. But in every single case, that has come back, and home ownership has exceeded its past record. And so I think we're going to have the same thing here. I think it's going to be, at least for a while, less dependent upon the investment component. It's a good, solid, long-term idea because it does build wealth, not just from appreciation, but have to remember, a mortgage is a forced savings program. Every one of those payments you make is a payment towards equity. And so you create a fair amount of equity by virtue of forcing you to make a mortgage payment that includes some equity. And therefore, I think Lawrence's graph of the fact that renters have a very, very low wealth is another primary reason why you will eventually see this return to the realization that that is ultimately young people's goals. Right now, it's just not possible because of all the factors we've mentioned.
Just anecdotally, the economists are way ahead of me on this, but let me speak. I have two young sons. Well, young, they're men now at 40. I know it's hard to believe because I'm only 50 myself, but just let me use their example. One lives in New York City, one lives in Los Angeles. And the idea of owning a home is completely, I won't say foreign to them, but they move. It's the demographic, it's job change. I mean, I can remember when I was coming up and building my career, if I put a resume on a desk that said that I had 7 previous jobs, that went in the garbage can. Now it's almost the opposite. If you put a resume down and you say, I've had 1 job, what was wrong with you? Aren't you ambitious? My point being is, with the younger generation, as I see it, from my vantage point, is very mobile, and they don't see owning as an investment. They figure out, hey, I'll rent for a while until they reach a certain socioeconomic status, then start looking, again, I'm talking about Los Angeles and New York, but then they start looking at penthouses and such. But normally, they would rather rent because they don't want to be tied down. I'm talking about married folks as well as just singles. So I think it really depends on the demographic. I mean, a dinosaur like me, I think home equity is awesome. I think owning ownership, and my wife will tell you, once that mortgage is paid off, that's a whole sense of freedom. So I really think it really depends a lot on demographic, on the age demographic. That's just, again, anecdotally my observation.
Dr. Yoon, does NAR have a policy? I mean, obviously we're vested as members in people owning homes, but is the goal of the organization to promote and encourage home ownership? I don't want to say at all costs, but, you know, just how objective is that for the organization?
So the ownership, I think that decision, people need to make a comfortable decision, meaning that if they are satisfied with renting, young people who are not married and they believe that they want to settle down before buying a home, I think all should be personal choice. However, things like mortgage interest deduction, which has been a tax incentive to own for 100 years, change of that will be change in the property rights because it would have some impact on the home values negatively. So the way I view it is, we should not actively promote, but something that is already in the system, like mortgage interest deduction, needs to be preserved. Furthermore, I think we also need to consider some of the social benefit, those intangible benefit, which is to say that people who own have natural, inherent stability. They have a view, they want to promote the stability of their area where they live. One recent example is the Egyptian revolution, and I hope that that all turns out for the better. But my understanding is that something like 85% of the people do not have clear title to the residence they were living in. So from their perspective, heck, let's have a revolution and let's shuffle the deck and let's see what happens. So there's more incentive for something radical change. But if there's a solid majority of homeowners, then people are looking for much more greater social stability within the country and system.
85% people do not have title to real property?
That was the case in Egypt, my understanding.
Goodness, we're going to be done in about 5 minutes. More questions from you? Would you repeat the question for the folks in back, please?
The question was the long-term ratio of house price to income was roughly 3. Is that sustainable, and what do I see about that in the future for Medford area and for Oregon? I might ask Josh to respond to the local numbers. I'm not quite as familiar with them. But I think the sustainability of that number for history is a good indicator that that's where we'll go back to, that people understand what they feel comfortable in affording. That number can be a little higher, the ratio can be a little higher if rates are really low, because it's dictated partly by what's your monthly payment, and therefore the monthly payment is lower if mortgage rates are lower. But they'll move back up to more sustainable levels of 5 or 6% as we move forward. And therefore, I think that ratio will come back to the same levels. Again, I have this solid feeling that this is inculcated into our culture, and that we're not going to move far away from our preferences for home ownership, and roughly 2/3 of the population will be back to that level. We may not get back all the way up to the 70% level we were at the peak, but I think that's a baked-in kind of sociological, economic preference that we'll get back to. And I think the ratio is the one that people are most comfortable with, not only because of the underwriting standards that limit the amount of money you can spend on a house anyway, but also people's comfort level as to what else they want to spend their income on.
Randy, did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned Dodd-Frank's half completed, and it's been a disaster for those of us in the development building industry. I'm a little worried about what the other half is going to look like. But before that gets to us, we got people in this room that want to build and develop and can't, and don't belong to a Fortune 500 company, and don't participate on Wall Street finances. So how are we going to get this back to a local lending issue and let some people borrow some money so they'll put it at risk and build some projects?
Yeah, a lot needs to be done. There is some effort to try to overthrow the law altogether. I don't think that's going to be successful for the same reason that a lot of other things in Washington aren't going to be successful, because you don't have a large enough motivating consensus to move it forward. But we have been, I think both of our organizations in particular, have been very effective in the rule writing. And it's interesting, Lawrence was right in his description of it. they sort of threw up their hands and said, we're going to clamp down really hard. But the other thing they did, because there's little consensus in Washington, they left a lot to the regulators. And unlike most legislation, which are pretty definitive and just leave the tweaks to the regulation, this left a lot open to regulation. And I think that's one of the reasons we're struggling so hard, is because these regulations could be very onerous or difficult but not impossible to deal with. And so what we're doing right now as organizations is lobbying heavily to make those the least possible restriction that we can accomplish. And I frankly, I think we're going to be fairly successful there. The first of these was the QM rule, and it came out okay. Not great, but okay. So that's some indicator that our successes will continue.
Well, I think we're all reaching for a common goal. I want to say thank you to the panelists for the effort and your time and your professionalism, your experience. Brad, you get the last word.
Good.
That's so rare, I know, but well, go ahead. We are going to wrap it up here. Just
I hope you've gotten a lot out of all my other comments this afternoon. Thank you for your attention. I just wanted to punctuate what was just said on the policy front. You heard each of the economists either say directly or allude to the policy challenges in Salem and in Washington, D.C. And I know there are two specific industries here, real estate and home builders. You have two fantastic associations, both in Salem and in Washington, D.C. You have a legislatively active, branches of those associations here locally, as well as a chamber, which does that work. I would just suggest to you that when you've got legislators working to kill mortgage interest deductions and 1031 exchanges, they're not looking out for your best interests, and they're not helping grow our local economy here. So stay in tune with those issues. Whether you reach out to Carlos or Tina or whomever, please stay engaged in those issues. It's critically important.
Very good, thank you. Carlos and Tina? What is that? Yeah, bring it. No, we got the final word. Moose Munch. Is that for me? Oh, it's for Josh. Now, see, gift baskets from our local, Harry and David Corporation. And if any of you are unable to get this in the overhead compartment, I will help you with the Moose Munch Crunch very specifically. We'll do that. Do you want to get a last word? Hey, you know what? Thank you for coming. We're all done here.